forum. Namely, what kind of institutions IAIR members are from, and also how many years of experience members typically have. So as you can see here, in the years in IR, we have 38 members that have 10 plus years of experience in IR. So many of you have been with IR for a fifth or more of our total years of being at IAIR. That's a mouthful. Then the institution, 49 of you come from public 2-year universities, 40 from public 4-year, 17 from private institutions, and 12 are other. And that there's a mix of you in there, a couple of vendors and other things. So we have a lot to offer our IAIR members this year, from 4 different slots for breakout sessions to happy hour activities this evening, the first of which is our keynote speaker, Dr. Trudy Bers. Please note that this keynote will be recorded in Zoom so we can post the recording later. I would like to introduce someone who knows our keynote speaker much better than I, Jim Kostecki, the Director of Research and Analytics at the College of DuPage. He knows Dr. Bers from working at Oakton Community College with her for 6 years, but also from professional networking opportunities like IAIR and AIR, the national conference. I will now turn time over to Jim to introduce Dr. Bers.
And hello, everyone. I wish I could see your faces, but we're going to do the best we can with Zoom. Hopefully you can hear me. And thank you, Aaron, for allowing me the distinct honor of introducing our keynote speaker for this very special anniversary of IAIR Forum. Trudy Bers, yes, my former boss at Oakton Community College, the one who saved me from the private sector and introduced me to this wild world of institutional research. And in fact, I think it was my 2nd week on the job, we traveled to the beautiful city of Galena for my first IAIR Forum, and I've never looked back. A little bit about Trudy Bers, president of the Bers Group, an educational consulting organization. She is also a data coach for Achieving the Dream, a coach for the Caring Campus initiative of the Institute for Evidence-Based Change, a mentor for the Student Success Academy of the HLC, a Higher Learning Commission, an adjunct faculty member for a doctoral program in community college leadership offered by the University of Maryland. And as we know, many of us know Trudy has a long history in institutional research. She has, as Aaron stated, was formerly the Executive Director of Research, Curriculum, and Planning at Oakton Community College, past President of IAIR, and the National Community College Council for Research and Planning. And nationally, Trudy has made a significant impact, as we all know, on institutional research with well over 50 published articles in professional journals, co-authored 2 online professional development courses for AIR, not to mention the countless presentations at national professional conferences throughout the country. So we look forward to Trudy's perspective on how much has changed, or perhaps not changed, in institutional research as we celebrate the IAIR's 50th annual forum. Ladies and gentlemen, Trudy Bers.
Thank you, Jim. And I had just seen your picture on screen when you were introduced as the person who was going to introduce me. So it's nice to see you, even though you're a little tiny box on my screen.
Right.
I am absolutely delighted to be with you all. I have not been at IAIR for some years. I officially retired from Oakton Halloween of 2013. But as what Jim said about me suggests, I've remained active in the professional world. Lest you think that the Bers Group is a large consulting company, let me tell you that when I retired from Oakton, I wanted a luggage tag that would make it appear that my luggage was not going to my home, but to an office. So I created the Bers Group. I gave a sample of my business card to a dear colleague, and she said, "Why don't you make yourself president?" So I went back to Visiprint. I modified the model for my card, and in between the price was cut in half. So by making myself president, I saved 50% on my business cards. If you could just flip through to the next screen, please. Okay, and you've already seen this information, so I'm not going to repeat it. Next screen, please. And I'm going to use some data, some information, and yes, some reminiscences to talk about, first of all, what I perceive has changed in IR over time, what mid-career advice I give myself now, and just a tiny bit about COVID-19 and IR. Next, please. But first, I'm going to ask you to do some work, and this is a way for you to get to engage a little bit with one another, because one of the joys of an in-person IAIR conference is always the network that occurs in the hall. Well, we don't have halls now, and we can't network in person, but I'm going to ask Kayla to put us into some breakout rooms and spend just a few minutes, identify a moderator or somebody who'll report out, identify one change you've seen in IR over the last 5 to 10 years. And when we regroup, I'll ask that a few of you report out. Not everybody will have a chance to do so, but the reporter, if you would put your changes in the chat room, that might make for some interesting conversation later as you all look at what changes you've seen in IR. So Kayla, if we could go to the breakout rooms, I would appreciate that.
Jim, are you not going to join them? You're not going to join?
Oh, I have to join. Oh.
Hey, Trudy, you there?
Kayla, was that you asking if I was here?
Yeah, I'm thinking give them 1 more minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's usually about a 60-second delay when breakout rooms
Yes.
are closed.
Yeah, like I was just going to hit the button. They'll have
Right.
60 seconds to wrap up. That's what I was going to do.
Okay.
Cool. I will go ahead and do that. And then I did broadcast a message saying, hey, here's a repeat of the question.
And I am not going to be able to see everybody, so maybe just have to ask for volunteers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they will be able to unmute themselves, so it should be fine. Yeah. Breakout rooms will close in 16 seconds. Okay, cool. We are all back.
Well, welcome back, everybody. I cannot see everybody, so I'm wondering if a couple of you would volunteer to share with us what in your breakout room you found was a change that occurred in IR over the last 5 to 10 years, or even further back if you want to go that far. Do we have any volunteers? You can unmute yourself.
Sam Miller from Community College Board. I'll volunteer for breakout room 2.
So what was the change, Sam?
According to the room, the technology changes, specifically using Power BI over the last year and a half, has allowed us to slice data as needed instead of compiling multiple ad hoc reports.
Okay, great. Do we have another volunteer?
We do also have some messages in the chat box
Yes, I'm
coming
seeing
in.
that as well. I think you can all see those. Do we have another volunteer? Technology is one change.
Hi, this is John Steffen. I was in group 11. I'm from Bradley University. We had a couple good ones. We had data visualization desires and capabilities have increased. The desire for using data from upper administration and faculty has increased. One gentleman was creating insight platforms for their users to create their own reports, which I thought was fascinating. And accreditation has kind of taken over some big chunks of the data needs that have been going out.
Great. And we have one more volunteer.
Sure, I can go.
Okay.
I'm Phil Graff from the University of Illinois. We were in breakout room 13. We highlight a few things like increasing the speed to data access for the end users. There's been increasing importance on data governance, who's the owner and who's responsible for cleaning and fixing and making sure that the data has integrity. And then there's also been a growing focus on equity-based data reporting, so grouping by kind of demographics and that type of thing.
Great. And I am going to suggest that the chat room entries be saved, and who knows, that might make for an interesting way to organize some professional development sessions at next year's IAIR. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So what's changed in IR over time? Globally, as I think back to the 35 years or so that I spent time in IR, when I started, it was mostly about compliance and counting. Compliance included iPads. It included the Illinois Community College Board. I was at the community college reports, and ICCB did the iPads reporting on behalf of colleges. It included accreditation reports. And we looked a lot at counting how many. We didn't much look at why, we just looked at what. I read an interesting article yesterday about the word count with respect to data. And the author said there are really two ways in which we use the word count. One way, which I just mentioned, is how many, but the other way is what's important. What counts when we are developing a program, deciding on awarding scholarships, or whatever the case may be. That was early IR. As we move, you can't see my body language, so I'm not sure, I'm gesturing with my hands below the table here. So a second element or a second phase of IR was movement towards assessment, planning, and program reviews. And assessment is a word that I think is often used in different ways without people being clear. One way that assessment is used is specifically with learning outcomes assessment. And we are probably all familiar with that, especially if you've done any work on a Higher Learning Commission report, because the accrediting agencies nationally are really driving learning outcomes assessment. The other way assessment is used is to talk about assessing students' skills as they enter an institution to see if they need any sort of developmental work. And actually a third way the term assessment is used is to talk overall when we're afraid of using the word evaluation. So we sometimes use the word assessment, which sometimes is perceived as carrying less of a potential threat to it. So that's sort of the middle phase of IR. And the phase that I think we are in now with IR is much more global. It's about institutional effectiveness, which is defined in a whole host of ways. Often we think first of institutional effectiveness as related to are we effective for students, but institutional effectiveness relates to financial stability, it relates to living up to the college's mission, it relates to effectively delivering programs and services, to creating an environment that is one in which people want to work and thrive, and you can go on and on in defining what IE means because it means different things in different places. And as part of this shift, many institutions no longer have an institutional research department, they have an institutional effectiveness department. And that language suggests that IR is way beyond just compliance and counting. Next slide, please. So one of the shifts I see is a real shift when we look at students from access to academic outcomes to post-college outcomes. We spent a lot of time early on talking about who's coming to us. Once they came to us, we sort of forgot about them. And then about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there was a shift and much more focus on outcomes, not only student learning outcomes, but completion and transfer. And now, and this I see as an even newer addition to the agenda, is what happens after college. Are students getting family-sustaining, wage-producing jobs? And is their health and well-being somehow improved as a result of their having gone through college? So the agenda for what we're trying to accomplish for students is much broader. And that means that IR needs to look at a lot more data from a lot more different sources to be able to look at what happens to students even after they leave the institution. Next slide, please. When I started in IR, I had never heard of these terms. And now in the work that I do, they are core to thinking about how we are looking at student progress. From leading indicators that we, and I'm using we globally, but in many cases this is faculty and the wraparound student support services, can directly affect are students being retained in class to the end of the term? Are they successfully completing their courses? Are they persisting? Are they reaching academic milestones? And are they completing? It's rare that a college can directly affect the completion rate without just giving away diplomas, and we don't do that. So the way that we can really affect that gold standard of completion is by making sure that students stay in classes, successfully complete them, return, although I certainly recognize that transfer is a good option for many students at this point, that they acquire the units they need. And I would add to this that they don't earn excess units. Some of the recent data reports, especially from Texas, are terrifying in looking at the number of excess credits that students are earning before they're actually getting their degrees. So this was new language that didn't exist. The concepts may have existed, but this language didn't really exist a long time ago in IR. Next slide, please. Alicia Dowd, who's a scholar, I believe she's at either UPenn or Penn State now. I love this definition of close to practice data because it really talks about the data that are needed by the actual people who can affect students' progress and success. Now, her focus here is on equity, but you can redefine this in any group that you want or students at large. But it's providing people with the data about what's occurring in their little worlds. And I'll talk more about this when I talk about democratizing data and sharing data among faculty. But I think that the concept of close to practice data is one to really think about, because you present faculty, for example, with global data about the college, and a likely response may be, but I can't change that. You give them data about the success of students in their courses, that's a different story. Next slide, please. So another change that's occurred that I think affects IR is that there are a lot of new ways of doing college. We know that dual credit across the nation has simply exploded. The Community College Research Center reported that the number of high school students in college courses rose 67% between 2002 and 2010, and it's probably escalated well beyond that figure now. A recent 2019 report, although they looked at fall 2009 data, is about a third of high school students took courses for college credit in the fall of 2009. The ICCB data on dual credit is more recent, and ICCB shows that dual credit course enrollments rose 25% between fiscal year 2015 and 19 in both credit hours, enrollments, and the head count, the unduplicated head count of students taking dual credit courses. Now, I know that dual credit is offered by four-year colleges and private schools as well, but the focus here is obviously on community colleges, at least for the CCRC and the ICCB data. And to my understanding, the majority of dual credit is offered at community colleges. Next slide, please. Another aspect of the new way of doing college is competency-based education and credit for prior learning. These have been around for a long time. And about every 6 months, there's an article I read about how it's time for CBE and credit for prior learning to really be acknowledged and to take off. And I still haven't seen a real explosion in the data showing how students are earning credits through these pathways, even though there's a lot of talk about how important these alternative ways of doing college can be for students. I don't need to read this to you, but I know that a number of colleges have set up fairly arduous pathways through which students earn credit for prior learning or demonstrate the competencies that then are deemed to be equivalent to a particular course and get credit that way. I don't know how many of your schools are doing this. I don't know how many of you are doing this in great numbers. But it is certainly something that these days I'm reading more and more about, in part because of COVID and students looking for alternative ways of earning credits. Next slide. So speaking of alternative credits and credentials and badges, that's a fairly new term, digital badges. Goldie Blumenstick, who is a senior reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education, has said it's all about the job when she talks about alternative credentials and particularly badges. And a recent survey by the University Professional and Continuing Education Association, a survey of 190 institutions, showed that 94% offered some type of alternative credit, only 5% offered digital badges. This is a fairly recent survey, and most often in business-related areas, especially IT. And 64% said that they saw these credentials as an important strategy for the future. I think one of the issues, and this is an IR issue, all of this is how do we count, how do we assess, how do we evaluate students who come in with all of these different ways of doing college. Some of the standard momentum metrics, like credits earned in the first term, may well fall away if a student is entering not only with dual credit, but with all these other alternative ways of earning college credit. Next slide, please. And finally, we have the providers. The for-profits, which for a while seemed to grow beyond expectation, saw a decline in enrollment from 2010 to 19. What's interesting is this fall, the for-profits were actually up in enrollment by 3%. And this is really, to me, interesting. In the younger adult student population, that is slightly older than traditionally aged, you can see that enrollment in the for-profits went up in double digit. And contrasting this with a 9% overall decline nationally in community college enrollments and a 20% decline in students aged 21 to 29 at public four-year institutions. Now, these are national data. So Illinois may be somewhat different, and your individual institutions, of course, could be even different from that. And then we have vendor certifications, often in IT, where a Microsoft, for example, will award, when a student takes a qualifying test, a certification attesting to the fact that the student has certain competencies. And many times employers in certain fields are looking for these certifications as validation of what a student can do, and may even be giving them more credence than traditional college credits in traditional college courses. So if we could move on, please. Okay, so again, that change in IR is all the different ways of doing college. We also have now state and national data sets. Now I'm going to reminisce a little bit. About 30 years ago, maybe 35, when I first started in IR, the public universities in the state got together and decided what data community colleges needed to have about how their students performed after transfer. And each year, sometimes each semester, community colleges received from each of the public universities the report that showed how our students had done based on how the universities decided we needed to have the data. The community college folks were not very happy about this. And there was a meeting, it may have even been an IAIR meeting, but I don't think so. I think it was a smaller meeting than this, at Allerton House outside of Champaign. And it was like somebody had passed a magic wand over the room, where the university transfer coordinators, because they were the gatekeepers of these data and these reports, they suddenly realized that maybe they should listen to what the community colleges wanted to know about how our students performed. And the agreement was made that there would be a shared data set of student-specific data. That was huge. That was absolutely huge, because before then, what we would get at community colleges, we'd get a list of names, but any of the data about student performance was aggregated. So we didn't know who did what. We had no way to go back and see what the individual students had done at our colleges. Since that magical date, There has been, of course, an expansion of state and national data sets. We still do not have a national student unit record data system. I'm guessing that that will happen, certainly in some of your lifetimes. But the National Student Clearinghouse has really made a sea change in the availability of student-specific data across almost all the colleges and universities in the country. And it's pretty hard to imagine now not using the National Student Clearinghouse to look at what's happening with respect to student enrollments and transfer and completion. Next slide. So here's an example. This report was issued in October of this year, so it's very new. And the National Student Clearinghouse looked at transfer as of the census date, and you can see the different ways in which the transfer pathways differed by the pattern of transfer: reverse, summer swirlers, lateral, upward. What was especially interesting to me was in the past few months, well, really since April on, there were so many predictions about how COVID would affect enrollments. And one of the assumptions, no data at that point, but one of the assumptions was that students would flock from four-year to two-year colleges because they didn't want to spend the money at a four-year college where their courses would be online, and maybe they couldn't even live on campus or in an apartment nearby. They would have to come and live at home. Anyway, they might as well save money and go to the local community college and earn credits and then maybe transfer on. That didn't happen. There was also an assumption that there would be increased challenges for students transferring from community colleges to senior institutions, and that didn't happen. And one of the real values, I think, of the clearinghouse data is that with data, we can test assumptions. Next slide, please. And how we present the findings and the data is also critical. I went to 3 common sources of higher education data: the Chronicle, Inside Higher Ed, and then there was a business report. And if you look at the headlines, they show different stories about what happened with fall enrollments. All of these stories reference the same National Student Clearinghouse report, but they're picking up different messages within that report. So I just thought this was a great example, which I'll get to when I talk about what I wish I'd known. So if you could go to the next slide, please. I think another thing that has really changed with IR over the years is partnerships. And they are both internal and external. You could read down the list of departments, and any IR department that is really valuable and central to the institution is going to have to work with and partner with a whole lot of different departments. One of, for me, the scariest things that occurs in a college with respect to IR, and it still goes on, is when individual departments keep their own data sets, create their own definitions of the data variables, don't document what they're doing, and then hand off those data to the next person who assumes the position. The data may reside, we used to say it would reside in the bottom drawer. It now may reside in a departmental website that's not accessible to anyone but people within the department, or even in somebody's private list of files that they don't share with anybody else. And that's very scary because it can lead to all kinds of confusion about data. What's official data, what's accurate data, how are you defining the variables, and so on. And there are a lot of issues that I see with partnerships internally as well as opportunities. One real issue is access. Who can read and who can modify? That is a relatively newer issue when people have access to so many data sets online. It's no longer, a box of punch cards. Consistency, which I've already referred to. How are data being compiled? How are they being kept? I used to say that I could show you that graduation ranged at Oakton from 5% to 95%. And I could document each of those data points depending on how I defined the variables and defined the population whom I was tracking. So the issues of consistency are not necessarily trivial. And let me give you an example. Some years ago at college, we would report students who were new to the institution, continuing students, and students who had returned to the institution after a time away. Somebody in the lower reaches of the IT department decided that the way to define students who'd been away was if they were required to submit a new application to the college. And so the college's policy was that a student who'd been away for at least a year had to submit a new application. And so we ended up with many more students who looked like they were new to the college rather than coming back after stopping out, because they had to submit a new application. So that's a really, I think to me, that's a really good example of the importance of getting into the weeds on operational data definitions. Data ownership is another issue. There are some departments that simply don't want to share their data. And they may have critical data, but they don't want to share. Sometimes the issue becomes one of privacy. Sometimes it's one of not understanding the ability to share. Another issue is dependencies. On whom are you dependent? It may be that the people entering data don't understand all of the different users of the data and why being accurate really matters. And so it's important, I think, for IR to work with other departments to ensure that everybody who touches those data, and I'm using touch virtually, not physically, understands how those data are used and the importance of being consistent and accurate. And then finally, to leverage resources, and this in a way presages one of the advices to myself, is every department doesn't have to do data itself. You can partner and share and leverage resources. So those are the internal partnerships. Now let's go to the next slide and look at external partnerships. And in part, this goes back to the role of IR now being about institutional effectiveness, which is a much broader portfolio, I think, than just counting and compliance, or even broader than that middle section, which is essentially assessment and program review. So if we look externally, there are all kinds of departments and organizations that the college interacts with, and where sharing data can be so important, both getting data from and sharing data with, and acquiring the services, whether voluntarily or for a fee, from vendors and other providers. And again, there are lots of issues and opportunities. Access, privacy, who do you share with, who do you share from, and how do you share? Do you, for example, mask students' names or share students' names? That becomes an issue when you're trying to work with local high schools, for example. Whether you share the names of students or you just provide general reports. So the external world with which IR interacts is, from my perspective, much bigger and broader than it used to be. Next slide, please. Technology. And you've mentioned this already when you talked about some of the changes you saw. When did Google become a verb that we all understand? When did I'll set up a Zoom become a commitment that we would all understand? So next slide, please. So I think this is some important advice. Selecting computer tools requires analyzing information requirements and audiences, assessing existing institutional research and computing capacities, creating or improving a planning database using computer experts, determining software needs, obtaining sufficient resources for independent operations, acquiring quality, and insisting on redundancy and alternative solutions for all key operations. Next slide. That advice was given 30 years ago by William Tetlow, who was a leader in AIR. And I think with a few tweaks of some wording, it still stands as being really important. I know one of the observations I make is I've worked with a number of colleges that are quick to acquire technology because they are convinced that having that technology will solve a problem and improve student success. And what they end up with is technology that is more challenging for them to manage and use than they had anticipated, that has bells and whistles that they'll never understand or use, and that doesn't link with other data sets and databases, so it becomes data in a silo, the value of which then becomes very limited. Next, please. So I was interested that one of your observations was the importance of Power BI, and I think there's actually a presentation following this keynote on Power BI. But these are just some of the logos of all of the different software packages that are available for recording data, for doing all kinds of things. And it used to be that SPSS and SAS were the games in town, and we certainly have many more than that now. So if we can move on. And there are a whole lot of other technology applications that go well beyond the ones that are shown on the preceding page, or at least duplicate some of them. And so in IR, one of the challenges, I think, is learning how to tap into and leverage the data that are available in these other applications that your college may have. There's been a lot the last few months on tapping into learning management systems to look at things like how often students are actually logging into their classes, how long they're staying online, how many of the course resources they're accessing. Because as we've all moved to a remote world, I have too, the LMS systems all seem to have capabilities that were either unknown or untapped or little understood before they became so central to how we're doing teaching and learning at all of our institutions. So if we can move forward. So disaggregation, you know, I didn't know that term. When I started in IR, we didn't know about disaggregation, except that ICCD required us to report certain subpopulations of students in enrollment data. But we have all kinds of disaggregations that are possible. The one that I like to pick on a bit is financial aid for open enrollment institutions where the majority of students are, if not on financial aid, barely above the threshold for financial aid eligibility. And I say that because often financial aid is determined by whether or not a student is Pell eligible or gets a Pell grant. But we all know at many of our institutions, there are students who are barely making it financially. And I don't think in any way we would consider them not to be financially at risk, and even more so these days. So just some examples of disaggregations. Next slide, please. Equity, and this was mentioned also in your comments about what's changed. Certainly the focus on equity has been growing over time, and in the last 8 or 10 months has become even more prominent. This is a new book, and it really is focusing on higher education, which is one of the reasons I think it's very good. McNair, Benjamin, and Malcolm Peake talk about being equity-minded. Next slide, please. And they talk about 10 obstacles to becoming equity-minded, and I think 2 of their obstacles are especially relevant to IR. Obstacle 3 is skirting around race. And Estella Benjamin, who's just a leader in the field of equity in higher education, talks about the misbegotten URM, underrepresented minority, as a data point. I love this phrase. I love it because basically what she's saying is we have a tendency to lump any small population of students into the unrepresented minority group. And the concern she has is that this allows us to skirt around talking about race. We tend to lump students together into this rather than disaggregating. Now, of course, the flip side of this is if the numbers are too small, then you get down to the point of not only confidentiality, but if you have 5 students in a subpopulation and 4 of the students were successful, do you really say that 20% were unsuccessful, 80% were successful when the total number is 5? So this is an issue to think about. The other thing she talks about, or the authors of the book talk about, is obstacle 4, resisting calls to disaggregate data by race ethnicity, because they don't want to seem to be calling attention to race ethnicity gaps. They want to say they're colorblind. And so this is another obstacle. What the authors of this book are really pushing for is to be able to really disaggregate that data, to see what the equity gaps are, and then to address ways to narrow those gaps. Next slide. Democratizing data, and that was also touched on when you talked about people being able to have access to data, doing their own reports, and so on. So I'm not going to read you the quote here. Kaylee has these slides, so she can share them with you if that's appropriate and if you want them. But if you could go to the next slide too. So one way that data are certainly democratized is through dashboards, 3 kinds. One of the things that always strikes me is when I work with a college that says, one of the ways we're going to improve how our students do is we're going to have a dashboard. And I say a dashboard does not improve student performance. It may help you track student performance. It may help you identify gaps, but by itself, a dashboard changes nothing in terms of actual assistance provided to students. So I get a little nervous when people think dashboards are equivalent to really doing something for and with students. Next slide. Warehouses. I never knew that there was an organization for warehouses, but there is in higher ed. And it's basically that single unified structure that pulls data from a lot of sources. That's why it's so important, going back to an earlier comment I made about the people who initially enter data, even understanding how the data will be used and why it needs to be accurate and definitions need to be consistent. One of the issues I think is also using real or frozen time data. That for people in IR may seem like a no never mind, but it isn't a no never mind for other people who think often that they need to use the most current data, and they don't understand why the numbers change between when they looked at the data at 4 o'clock yesterday and 4 o'clock today. So one of the lessons to know and to help others who use data but aren't as data adept as we in IR are, is to help them understand the difference between live and frozen data and the appropriate uses for each. So next. So I want to walk you through briefly a case study from Pierce College. Pierce College is in the state of Washington. And it has become, probably in the community college world, the single best example of democratizing data with faculty. They share with faculty all data about course success by faculty name. And it took them about 5 years that they've been doing this. Faculty have to go through training. They have a series of Tableau dashboards they're able to disaggregate. This began with the math faculty that were interested in why in some math sections of the same course or with the same instructor, students did better than in other sections of the same course with different instructors. And so the math faculty began to meet and talk about what they were doing in their math courses, and they discovered things like they didn't all have consistent assignments in sections of the same course. They didn't look at the sequencing of math courses to be sure that each of them was really preparing students for the next course in the section. And they moved through a tremendous reorganization of all their math courses driven by faculty but it started with looking at the variation in student success in sections of the same math course taught by different instructors. I thought it was really interesting that at Pierce College, the culture evolved. You might think of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross here. I was almost going to put in one of her little, Sages of Grief cartoons. But the culture evolved from data doubt. Well, that data can't be right. That's not how my students do. To data guilt or data blame. Well, it's not my fault, or, well, I must be doing something right. What are you doing wrong? To a culture of curiosity and inquiry where the data really is the foundation for faculty conversations. So next slide. So again, I'm not going to read all of this, but these are Pierce College's keys to success. And you notice, I think one of the ones that's most important is they use data to look at faculty progress in improving the performance of students in their classes over time. They do not use the data punitively or for blame. And they recognize that one data point doesn't tell the whole story. Next, please. So this is an example from Pierce College of how they share the data. This is the average one-year course completion date by faculty member, and the faculty at Pierce would actually have the names of the faculty. They would know who they are on each of these bars. And this is a single course that obviously has a lot of sections and a lot of faculty. It may be English 101, I'm not sure. But what you see is a tremendous difference in the success rate of students by faculty member in the same course. Next slide. I love this. This is from a faculty member at Pierce who said, data are like metal detectors. They tell you where to dig. And in the Pierce College example, they dug into why students' success rates were so different across colleges. Across faculty. Qualitative data is another big shift, I think, in IR. We used to, remember count? Compliance and count. Well, now we're interested more in the why. And there's so many different ways that we can get at the why. Artifacts, documents, focus groups. Some years ago at Oakton, we did something called photo elicitation. I absolutely hate that term, but it's a great technique. We gave students at that time the little portable cameras. Now they'd all use their phones. And we asked them to take pictures of what was especially meaningful in connecting them with the college or what told the story of the college. We did this in some classes, picked out some of the pictures that seemed most interesting, went back to the individual classes and asked the students to talk about why they took those pictures and what those pictures meant for them. And one of the most interesting ones was the students took a picture of a bulletin board that was very crowded with all kinds of clippings attached to it in no order, and it was just a mess. And the person who was head of our marketing department at the time went crazy when she saw a messy bulletin board. Remember what bulletin boards were even, because she thought it made such a bad impression for the college. So when we asked the students why why he took that picture, he said, it's the only place my cell phone gets reception. And what that told us was at that time, this was some years ago, cell phone reception was really critical. It was not even throughout the institution. And therefore, if we wanted to post something that we really hoped students would pay attention to, we should put it in the areas where cell phone reception was good. So next slide. So here's another good book, You're Not Listening. And I love the phrase, don't rob people of their stories. And to say things like, tell me about the last time, rather than, did you have a problem? Yes, no. I think it's also important to remember that data sets tell us what, but not why. And one of the things that was learned this summer with respect to COVID, a number of colleges, of course, had been surveying their students about what their needs were with respect to COVID. And when it came to technology, the colleges assumed that students would say they needed internet connectivity or they needed computers or tablets. But instead, what turned out to be absolutely critical for a whole lot of students was just they needed a quiet place to work. And that was not what the people conducting these surveys had anticipated, but they really learned something by asking. Next slide. So knowing the community, and I am vastly running out of time here, so I'm going to go through this very fast, and you can read that. Okay, next slide. I also want to mention the Opportunity Atlas, the next slide please, which is a remarkable tool that basically tells the story that where you grew up stays with you. Next slide. I tried to look at the state of Illinois. I couldn't do the state of Illinois, but I was able to do around Lake Michigan. And this shows the different shadings show the median college graduation rate for children who grew up in these communities. And then the median, and you see 31% for all, next slide please, for all children who grew up in these communities. White 33%, next slide. Black 20%, next slide. Hispanic 21%. And what this is saying is where you grew up makes a huge difference. It stays with you through at least young adult. So now, next slide. What mid-career advice I'd give myself? Find a place at the table. It doesn't matter if you volunteer to take notes. That's a really powerful way to have a say at the table. People don't like to take notes. I always used to volunteer to take notes because I knew that was a pathway to power, even though other people thought I was just being a good person. Document, 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 define your time. How often have you done something you thought you would know exactly how you define the variables, where you got the variables, the date of the variables, and you come back even a month later, let alone 6 months or a year later, and you don't remember. Avoid data lust. More data isn't necessarily better data. Tell the story in the title. Remember those headlines about the National Student Clearinghouse recent report? Provide key findings in addition to the data. Don't be afraid as an IR person to say, here are some of the findings, or here's what the data are pointing to. Don't let the search for the perfect drive out the good. You know, how many times have you spent hours and hours and hours because your count was off by 5 people? We have to remember in IR, we are not making decisions about whether I, Trudy Bers, earned enough credits to earn my degree. In those instances, it is really critical to be 100% accurate. But in IR, we're telling a broader story. So don't let the search for the perfect drive out the good. Keep your knowledge and skills up to date. Attending IAIR is certainly one good way to do that. And don't assume you have to do it all alone. Earlier, I talked about partnerships. Virtually walk around your campus and find out with whom you might partner that you haven't, with whom you have partnerships that might be expanded. So that's some of the mid-career advice. Next slide. I think some of the real issues with COVID and IR is what different data do you want to collect? How do you annotate data from what I call pandemic terms? And what traditional IR practices might be discarded, revised, or sustained? And I would actually like to expand that to say what institutional practices might be discarded, revised, or sustained now that we've learned how to operate differently. Next slide. I am not going to spend time on this because I'm already over time. So I'm going to ask Kayla if she would make these slides available to you. I think that this is just an interesting poll that was done very recently about who was looking for data after COVID. It's not after COVID, it's when I think people began to realize the seriousness and the long-term nature of the pandemic. So, next slide, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. I don't know if we have time for any questions. Kayla, you are my timekeeper, or Aaron.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Bers, for your insights and everything. I did post, if you do have any questions, please add those to the chat, and then I will make sure to ask or get the questions later to Dr. Bers, and she can always reach out, or we can send her response on to you as well, if you want to message us privately. But actually, thank you again. I'm going to turn it up. Next, we have just kind of an awards presentation quick. So I'm going to turn some time over to our incoming president, Amy.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to quickly say on behalf of the steering committee and the membership, I'd like to present Kathy, our outgoing president, with a plaque to express our appreciation for your past year of service as IAR president. Kathy's leadership has been invaluable in seeing us through these unprecedented times, and she's been great at keeping us moving toward achieving the goals of streamlining our processes as a steering committee and improving member benefits. I look forward to following your example in the next year. Thank you for your service, Kathy.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. So just a couple announcements before our next sessions. I know I want to give you enough break time before the next breakout session to kind of get ready. But we have our first slot of breakout sessions following this. Please note that 2 of them aren't going to be recorded, the innovative solutions for Power BI. So if you are going to those and the higher education attainment, equity, and college pipeline, those will be just live for now. So please go if you were thinking, if you are scheduled for those. Before we let you get into those first slot of sessions, we have you will be muted upon entry, but you'll have the ability to unmute yourself. So just please be thinking about that and listen to the session facilitator and presenter on how they'd like to get the feedback and questions from you. Another item is that for every session slot you're in, you'll be in the Zoom meeting, and then you'll be broken out into the breakout room. While in the breakout room, you'll have the option to leave the breakout room and go back to the general meeting, and then otherwise, you'll have another button that pops up that will leave both of them. If you leave that breakout room and want to go back into the main area, Kayla can always put you into another breakout session. Please make sure you're logged into Zoom, otherwise your browser will not pick up on those links that we pre-assigned, and that will not work. So please make sure you're logged into Zoom. And finally, please fill out the evaluations for the sessions. They were included in the email this morning. Please select NA for any items that really aren't available for these sessions. Because we're meeting virtually, the bylaws for the committee have those evaluations set for every question for that AIR Best Presentation Award. So please select the NA, but bear with us. Sounds great. And thank you again, Dr. Bers. We really appreciate it. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
My pleasure.
Have fun, everyone. See you soon. Nope. Come on. Oh, come on.